All right, so it's June 18th, 2020. I'm talking to Andreas Antonopoulos about Bitcoin, resilience, financial system, wallets, threats. You're in Potkaars. Potkaars is a pot with candle. There's a camera on top there. And that's my guest. Welcome, Andreas. I warned you about your introduction.
Oh, no, it's Alec. Thank you.
All right, so where are you from? Where are you currently in the world?
I'm currently at undisclosed location number 4 in the United States.
In the
US.
US.
I recently moved from undisclosed location number 3.
So at your undisclosed location 3 or 4, are things safe? Are you okay?
Yes, it's everything's safe, and I'm very fortunate to have a nice place to stay. And I still have a job, I still have food, I have a roof over my head. I'm very, very happy with my life right now. Okay. I wish other people could say the same. It's very difficult. I know for many people out there. I've been quite lucky.
Yeah, exactly. And things change on a dime, right? We had a fairly peaceful world, safe, healthy back in January, and then everything changed. So, okay, so this is my introduction. I'm the guy that was looking for a lifeboat ever since 2008, and that started to educate myself on things. Not so much as you, when you dug into Bitcoin, but still. And now everything's changed. And what I'm seeing 2 of my sources of information on the internet saying different things here. So on the one hand, I have Max Kaiser calling Bitcoin an unstoppable beast. You can't block it, you can't ban it, and it's going to devour the financial system of fiat monies. I'm paraphrasing here. And on the other hand, there's Mr. Martin Armstrong. You're familiar? Are you familiar with Martin Armstrong?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay, I'll introduce him a little further then for the rest of the audience also. And he says, well, should Bitcoin grow? First thing what will happen is that the current financial system will disallow it. It will not be allowed. It will be killed before it makes any progress. Martin Armstrong is the guy that created a very sophisticated computer program called Socrates, and he's analyzing all financial flows in the world. And he was the guy that predicted the USSR to fall back in the day, and made some other predictions that landed him in jail. Oh, you're trading stocks with foreknowledge. How did that happen? So he didn't want to say. That was his computer program, and he's making these kind of forecasts, looking at things cyclically. So he says Bitcoin is not going to be allowed. Kaiser says it's going to be the biggest thing of all. So I've invited Andreas Antonopoulos, the other guy that I've been following for a couple of years, trying to understand Bitcoin. So that's your trade. If I were to introduce you, you make a very complicated piece of software very easy to understand and explain.
Well, thank you.
The implications to the world of finance and the world of people feeling insecure. Would you add anything to that?
No, that's a great introduction. Thank you. Very kind of you. Okay.
So first off, Armstrong says it will not be allowed. It will be blocked by the central banks, by the powers that be. How would you respond to that?
I think both are right in certain ways. It's merely a matter of the time frame that you're looking at and the overall perspective. Let's be honest. If Bitcoin succeeds in its primary goals, then of course it will be banned, and it will be banned by many countries because Bitcoin is fundamentally a mechanism for decentralizing power over finance and removing power from centralized institutions and instead redistributing it to the participants of the system who gain an enormous amount of independence and self-sovereignty from being able to use a financial system that is purely digital, that is decentralized, that is the internet of money. And if it succeeds in those goals, and it already is succeeding in those goals, if it continues to succeed in those goals, of course, it is going to offend the greatest financial interests and powers on this planet, and they will do everything they can to stop it. The real question is, what is it that they can do to stop it in a practical sense? And the answer is not much.
Okay,
and that's the ultimate problem. They will try. One of the interesting things that happens is if they try and fail, the failure to stop it proves the primary point of Bitcoin. So in failing to stop it, they strengthen it, because every time they fail, they prove further that this thing is resilient, is robust, and can continue to operate. And even if they succeeded to slow down, disrupt, or stop Bitcoin or the network as it exists today, all that would do is force developers to develop countermeasures to build a slightly different system, a slightly improved system that fixes the mechanism by which they stopped it or slowed it down, and start it again and again and again. Ultimately, Bitcoin is a system of mathematics. It's an idea, and you can't prevent people from thinking ideas.
No, that's true. However, for Bitcoin to succeed in being the lifeboat I'm looking for, so there's different lifeboats, right? Be happy, have a family, be in a safe, secure, maybe undisclosed location, and store your whatever value you have in different assets like cash or Bitcoin or gold or silver or what have you. There are some threats that I came up with. I'd like you to respond to that. Let's do that in a few moments.
Sure.
First off, just yesterday, I was talking to Max Kaiser on a broadcast that he did, and he said he saw a different outcome. And instead of governments trying to ban Bitcoin, they would engage in a hash war to try and become Bitcoin dominant. And he says that's a dead certainty because you can't stop it, so you're in agreement there, probably. But all it takes is one government to start a global hash war by adding Bitcoin to their strategic reserves. And he says we're already seeing this building. So to your knowledge, are governments involved in Bitcoin other than trying to block it?
I mean, we can't know, and that's one of the beauties of the system. But if governments did engage in a hash war, all they would be doing is throwing investment at strengthening Bitcoin. If any government decides that it's in their strategic interest to participate in mining and increase the hash power of the network, and that encourages other governments to compete, all that does is strengthen the underlying security of the network and make it even harder to disrupt. I haven't seen any indication that any government is doing that. For the time being, they are massively underestimating the threat of Bitcoin to their financial system because they think it's a joke. And I hope they continue to massively underestimate it and think it's a joke for another decade.
One of the things that I learned from you was your way of explaining that Bitcoin's power consumption is actually a good thing. So if you need lots of, I'm paraphrasing here, but if you need lots of power to mine your Bitcoins, you could do that on a location where not too many people are, but where energy is cheap. For instance, like with a big water reservoir or whatever, and you have hydropower. So right now we're in a situation where the entire global economy has been shut down, and we're going to feel the hurt in the months and years to come. Maybe not yet today, even though millions of people are unemployed and are hurting, but there's going to be more pain. Now, there are people that they will hurt also, but they would also go, there's some positive side to this. At least we're not hurting the environment anymore. We're not burning coal and other products as much as we used to. We're not flying as much as we used to. Now, if one of these hash wars, if that hash war would commence and Bitcoin would consume way more power, your argument of it being a friendly consumer of power would be negated, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean the problem with that we have with energy on this planet is not a problem of consumption. It's not a problem of making choices in resource allocation because markets are best at doing that. It's a problem of production. And if we are concerned about the production of energy, which is produced from carbon negative ways, such as burning coal and releasing carbon into the atmosphere, then we should think more hardly about addressing the root cause, which is the release of carbon into the atmosphere, and build mechanisms either through regulation or market forces that address that. addressing it 2 or 3 degrees removed downstream at consumption and making normative judgments about which type of consumption of electricity is good versus bad leads to much magnified negative side effects. Because if you substitute market decision making on consumption with centralized decision making on consumption, you distort the markets in very radical ways. Where we should be looking is at production and what the direct impact on the environment is from the production of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Yeah. So carbon, and we should regulate and build markets around carbon because that's the problem. It has nothing to do with consumption. And I think it's very dangerous to substitute market forces in terms of the energy market with directed decision-making from a central government or several governments as to what is good consumption and what is not, because you're never going to get agreement on that, and it will massively distort economic output.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, but you can use the negative marketing if you want to oppose Bitcoin. If you're afraid of Bitcoin, let's say you are the central bank or you're the IMF or what have you, and you perceive that as a threat because it's grown to a certain level. Oh, you could use the environmental appeal, right? So that
right, but that's a lie. So the bottom line is that kind of propaganda will happen regardless. But the real issue is that that's a lie. Yeah. The greatest polluters on the planet are militaries, and they produce no usable function other than death and destruction on a massive scale. And they're very, very heavily funded by governments, and they're funded primarily through inflationary and debt spending from the current monetary system. So it's entirely ironic and also disingenuous to blame a cryptocurrency for environmental damage when it's precisely the central bank inflationary debt system that funds not only the industry of death, which is the war machine, but also funds misallocation of resources on a massive level in terms of energy production and consumption. Yeah. You know, keep in mind that in the US, at least, the entire war machine exists in order to control the production and distribution of oil, and is used primarily for that. So it's very, very hypocritical to turn around and blame cryptocurrency. Of course, it is going to happen. Yeah. We need to take that propaganda together with other forms of propaganda and ignore it, and look at the actual facts. The facts are that the cost of energy production through solar panels and renewable energy has now dropped below most other forms of energy production. And because Bitcoin can be mined anywhere, and the mining of Bitcoin can move very, very quickly, it creates the conditions to actually make the majority of Bitcoin mining migrate to places where you can build very, very efficient solar panels and export energy. And as a result, what it does is it encourages the deployment of alternative energy, and it subsidizes the deployment of alternative energy, which will push the cost of solar panels and other related technologies down much faster, and acts as a great mechanism for increasing the environmental wellness of the planet. So it's really a matter of truth versus lies, and there will be lies, and we need to examine the truth instead.
So you mentioned, thank you for that. So you mentioned United States politics. Halfway through that, let's move to your latest tweet at the moment of recording, which is about President Trump ordering Steve Mnunchin to focus on a clampdown on Bitcoin over negotiating a trade with China. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton reportedly claims that in his new book. Now, Trump, back in 2018, apparently ordered to clamp down on Bitcoin. Now, my question to you is, was it just for tax revenue? Was that all Trump was doing, or what's your feeling with that?
I think it's wrong to try to look for some great reasons and logical construction some elaborate mechanism of policy, some system of thought behind the latest pronouncements of President Trump. President Trump has demonstrated repeatedly that the last thing that someone whispers in his ear or he sees on TV, he will turn around and say without any critical thinking and present as his own idea. And he is very easy to manipulate by his advisors who basically run policy by whispering. And he will believe uncritically and repeat unthinkingly anything that's said to him. So the idea that somehow there's a policy or a plan or something, no, somebody just mentioned it in a conversation and it caught his attention, and he said it back to Mnuchin, and that's it. And right. That's not a very good basis for building policy, but it is what we have right now. And so he probably got distracted by another idea shortly thereafter, and nothing really materialized from this.
No, we haven't seen much materialize. That would be my follow-up question. I mean, if this statement was made in 2018, we're in 2020 now. I mean, all hell's breaking loose on all other fronts, but not on opposing the Bitcoin front, right?
Yeah, I mean, Mnuchin has bigger things to do, like, for example, raid the Treasury to enrich himself and his friends. Given that he is a crook of incredible proportions. The fact that Mnuchin isn't in jail, but instead is heading the Treasury is astonishing if you read the history behind this man, who was very much involved in the mortgage fraud in 2008 and has a history of fraud and escaping conviction again and again. And so he's not going to waste time at Treasury chasing the latest phantom that emerged from Trump's tiny mind. He's going to focus on his primary goal, which is enriching himself. Now, he managed to get, a couple of $1 trillion of stimulus for the pandemic as a personal slush fund to distribute to his friends without any oversight and accountability. And he's been busy doing that.
Thank you for that elaborate explanation of Mr. Mnuchin. All right. So back to Bitcoin. I asked you a moment ago if you see or feel that state actors are moving into Bitcoin, and you said, well, you can't know. I mean, you can't know who is behind a public key, behind a wallet ID. However, you can see if there's large purchases or smaller purchases. Now, I mentioned Max Keiser a moment ago, so he's all into Swan and making very small purchases for everybody, right? If you don't have much money, at least spend a little bit and move that into a Bitcoin for your own small lifeboat. But do you see a trend changing over the last couple of years of big purchases, Bitcoin-wise, as compared to very small ones?
Well, you can't see purchases either because...
But you can see the amount moving into wallets.
Not really, because the vast majority of trading happens on custodial exchanges where the transactions are recorded in the order book on their own databases.
Okay.
It's only when people decide to withdraw, and people may have billions of dollars on exchanges, that they trade back and forth. And they never withdraw, and they never do a transaction on the blockchain that would actually reveal their trading activity. So it's actually not possible to see what's happening other than what's reflected in the price.
Okay, thank you.
And really not an area of interest or expertise for me. So I kind of stay out of the whole investment trading and price discussion.
Yeah. No, we're not talking.
I think it's ironic, however, that discussion of whales and manipulation of markets is rampant when the price is stable or going down. And then when the price peaks, everybody is kind of celebrating the success of Bitcoin and the proof of its principles, and nobody thinks that's market manipulation. So it's a very asymmetric type of analysis that I think is really without any substance.
Okay. So at the start of this conversation, I said I was going to come back to some of the threats to my little lifeboat that I'm seeing out there. So let me run them by you at the close at the close of this conversation. So Most consumers like me, I'm just an average consumer guy with a job and a Windows computer recording this little podcast. So, I mean, if Bitcoin becomes perceived as a threat, my imagination can come up with the idea that a Windows update will not allow my wallet software to run on the Windows computer. Is that a real threat, or am I just being creative?
No, not really, because it's impossible to control general purpose computing devices in that way. It's very, very easy to break out of that kind of environment and to install whatever software you want. General purpose computing, because of the way it's structured, is impossible to control, which is why digital rights management and software protections and copyright protections, et cetera, have been a dead end. They've been trying to control our computers for the past 25 years. And the simple truth is, even in the most controlled environments, let's take, for example, the Apple iPhone. Every year there's a new announcement about a new mechanism to jailbreak these phones and release them from being controlled devices. So no one can stop you from running the software you choose to run on devices that you own and control. They can make it difficult, but not stop you. So
but the vast majority of the general population will not be in the business of jailbreaking their telephone, and removing software from the App Store will hinder those people.
Yes. So then what that means is that the people who will end up using it are the people who have the greatest incentives and really need that lifeboat. Because if you need that lifeboat, there is no amount of difficult learning or hurdles you have to jump or things you have to do to your phone and your computer in order to get into that lifeboat. And you see that in countries where it is very difficult to get access to Bitcoin, but they have very, very high traffic because it is a matter of necessity. It will stop the speculators who are just playing around with this and gambling and have other options. And it will really focus the market onto the people who need it most, who will jump over any hurdle, no matter how high it is, in order to access an independent financial system. In fact, measures to control people's computers and to prevent them from running the software that allows them to access Bitcoin or other forms of banning like that will send a very, very strong signal that this is a system the governments are trying to stop you from using, which ironically, for those who are trying to get into the lifeboats, is a very, very good signal that this lifeboat is worth getting into. It's if you look at countries like Venezuela, or any of the other places where you have strong-armed dictators trying to inflate the currency into nothingness and play monetary games, when they come out on television and they say, "Trust us, the central bank has everything under control, and you should absolutely not use Bitcoin because it's for criminals," everybody in the country goes, "Huh? So you're a dictator and you're always lying, and you just told me Bitcoin is something I shouldn't use because it's dangerous. Great. Let's get some Bitcoin, people." I mean, it's a very direct signal. The important thing to realize here is that in countries where the rule of law actually has weight, where the government institutions are somewhat trusted, where decision-making is based on reason and logic and the betterment of society, these countries will not and cannot ban Bitcoin because it goes against the fundamental principles of freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of commerce, and self-determination by their citizens. So they wouldn't do that.
I mean,
in countries where they would do that, the rule of law is very weak. So it's impossible to enforce these things. The trust of government is very low, and there is no reasoned or logical basis for decision making, in which case the fact that they ban it means nothing to most citizens because they ban lots of things that make no sense, and people do them anyway. So especially in those places, that's when you know you need to get into the lifeboat. It's when the captain is telling you, ignore the fact that the deck is at a 45-degree angle, everything is fine. And you're like, okay, get in the lifeboat. They're lying to us.
Well, now you're talking to Europe, right? So I'm in the Netherlands. And
Yes.
we're supposed to be a very solid democracy with a nice long history. So right now, in just in the change of a couple of days, most of my basic human rights have been cancelled. Our constitution has been cancelled. Transparency of government has been cancelled. You can't do the FOIAs anymore. They're not being answered anymore. Shops have been closed forcefully. So that's happening in the Netherlands. And then in the European Union, they fight amongst each other, but now they're pretty much united in saying, oh, we need lots of money, like hundreds of billions of euros for support funds. So way fast, massive changes are being made in an environment that was perceived to be very constitutional and democratic only in January. So these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, and there's a very good excuse for that, and you know, it's up to you and the other people who live in the European Union to make sure that whatever temporary measures are temporary and are not imposed in the long term. And, you know, it takes a crisis to test the fundamental constitutional principles of a country. That's when you really see what your democracy is made of. But I would disagree that your rights and constitution have been extinguished. I think Europe still has very strong institutions, and those institutions are resistant to long-term disruptions of democratic ideals. So I'm not particularly concerned that this is going to be a long-term situation, or that Bitcoin is going to be banned or anything like that in Europe anytime soon.
Yeah, well, out of the context of Bitcoin, I'll move back into Bitcoin for my last question in a moment. But
okay.
Just this coming Sunday, I'm organizing a massive demonstration in The Hague to protest these measures being put into law without end.
And remarkably, you are still free to speak about this on a podcast and not currently in prison just for trying to organize a protest. And you will probably be able to go and do this protest and not be arrested or executed in the street. So I think you're still in a pretty good position.
I'll likely not be executed. I'll give you that. However, a similar protest with only 30 people was dismantled, and they were put in
right. And that is a big concern. So
yeah, exactly.
the restrictions on freedom of protesting is a very big problem throughout the world.
All right. So you have been following the adoption of Bitcoin throughout the world for years now. Is its use outside the fiat system, just used as a currency between people, maybe in poorer communities or people that aren't banked? Do you see that increasing? Is something changing there?
Well, across not just Bitcoin, but across the whole cryptocurrency space, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's growing and growing and growing all the time across many different use cases. Because, you know, all adoption is adoption. If you're using it as a lifeboat, if you're using it as a high-risk investment with volatility and yield, if you're using it to balance your portfolio, if you're using it as an institutional investment, if you're using it to do cross-border transactions as a business, if you're using it to pay outsourced workers, or if you're using it to do retail transactions, or you're using it to escape a dictatorship, all of those uses are uses. And if you sum all of those up, the number of people who, first of all, have heard of this system and have heard of it repeatedly, and know that despite all attempts to shut it down and all declarations of the fact that it's dead, it is not dead and it has not been shut down. Every time they hear that, it strengthens their belief in the resilience of the system. And all of those people who hear about it eventually try it, or some of them do. And of those who try it, some of them start using it on a more regular basis. Some decide to earn crypto through their labor, through their products that they build, through services. And in entering the crypto space, they exit the fiat economy, which is a very powerful movement. And this is happening worldwide. And it started happening for thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. And one day we'll be talking about billions. Cryptocurrency is not going away. I don't think Bitcoin is going away either, although it might evolve and change in ways to resist future threats. And the bottom line is that once this was unleashed on the world, it's simply a matter of time. Where it is needed, it will be used. And as long as we make it possible for people to take that choice, then it's a system that gives people freedom.
All right, so you're a public speaker and you're watching the world. What's the coolest new development that you have seen over the last months or years in this area?
In cryptocurrencies?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm, as you know, probably, I think the two most interesting things for me were the development of smart contracts platforms, which unleashed a whole new category of systems around decentralized finance and programmable smart contracts with the launch of Ethereum. I find that very interesting. I've written a book about it. That technology is still developing. It solves different problems than Bitcoin does, and it has some weaknesses. Of course, I'm not talking about it from the perspective of an investment. I'm talking about it from the perspective of technology. And the other big development is the development of layer 2 technologies, not just in Bitcoin, but across many different blockchains that enable both better scaling, better privacy, faster transactions, lower use of the base blockchain, as well as in the future, integration and interoperability between blockchains in a trustless manner, where effectively what that means is you can move from one cryptocurrency to another, from one blockchain to another, without any centralized custodians, without any exchanges, by doing things like atomic swaps or payment channels between blockchains. And that brings it into more of an ecosystem. If you lower the barriers and it's possible to move inexpensively, quickly, and without trust from one blockchain to another, that opens up a whole other layer of applications that leverage the capabilities of each blockchain in an interesting way. And I find that fascinating. So my current book that I'm writing now is called Mastering the Lightning Network. I'm writing it with my co-authors. So it's myself, Olaulo Shintoken, and Rene Picard. And so you can actually watch that book being written. We're writing it open source on GitHub, the Lightning book. And I'm hoping to get that published just after the end of the year.
Excellent. All right, Andreas, Antonopoulos, I'll link it. Other topics that we went through here, I'll link them under this conversation. Thanks for being here. Stay safe.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Rico, for having me on the show. Stay safe yourself, and good luck with everything.
And you. Bye-bye, my friend.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make.
You think I'm joking? Predator drones. You will never see it coming.
Laat staan dat ik kan ingaan over vuur.